The moment Lydia Gentry stepped off the stagecoach and sank both boots into the mud of Caldwell, Kansas, she looked up at the gathered crowd with eyes that could strip the bark off a pine tree and said, loudly enough for the whole dusty street to hear, "Well, this is considerably worse than I was promised." It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a man leaning too far over a ledge, loud and restless and smelling of cattle and ambition. The town had only recently incorporated, its streets still more dirt than anything resembling order, its saloons more plentiful than its churches, and its men more plentiful than either. The stagecoach had come down from Wichita after a 3-day journey that had rattled Lydia's teeth and tested every ounce of her considerable patience, and the rain the night prior had turned the main thoroughfare of Caldwell into something closer to a riverbed. Isaac Easton was leaning against the post of his supply store when she stepped off. He had been there to collect a crate of hardware that was supposed to be on that coach, and he had not been expecting anything else of particular interest to arrive with it. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had seen a razor perhaps 3 days ago but no sooner. He had lived in Caldwell for 6 years, had built his store with his own hands and the help of 2 friends, and had generally come to the conclusion that life would be exactly what it was for some time to come. He had not been unhappy about that, exactly. He had simply stopped expecting it to surprise him. Then Lydia Gentry stepped down from that stagecoach with mud climbing up the sides of her brown leather boots, a carpet bag in one hand, and a traveling trunk being wrestled down by the driver behind her. And she looked at the whole town like it owed her an apology, and had not yet delivered it satisfactorily. And Isaac felt something shift inside his chest so suddenly that he pressed a hand to his sternum as if checking whether something had come loose. She was 26, though he would not learn that for another hour. She had dark auburn hair pinned up in a style that the journey had done its best to destroy, and she wore a traveling dress the color of late autumn leaves, practical and without excessive ornamentation, and she had a way of standing that made it clear she had never once in her life waited for permission to occupy whatever space she was in. Her eyes were gray-green, though he could not see that from where he stood. What he could see was the set of her chin and the directness of her gaze, and the fact that she did not flinch when old Bill Tarver, who ran the freight operation and had a voice like a wagon wheel on gravel, came barreling out of the crowd to ask what business she had in Caldwell. "I am the new school teacher," she said, and her voice was crisp and clear and carried a northeastern edge to it that stood out in the Kansas air like a church bell. "And I would appreciate it if someone could direct me to wherever it is I am expected to sleep, because I have been sitting in that coach for the better part of 60 hours, and I am not in the mood for ceremony." Bill Tarver opened his mouth and then closed it again, which was something Isaac had never seen happen to Bill Tarver in the 6 years he had known the man. Someone in the gathered crowd pointed toward the boarding house run by Mrs. Clara Henshaw, and Lydia Gentry nodded sharply, picked up her carpet bag, and began walking through the mud without any evident concern for what it was doing to her boots, dragging the trunk behind her because the driver had set it down at the side of the road and was already moving to unload the other cargo. Isaac pushed off the post he was leaning against. He did not think about it. His legs simply carried him forward, and he reached the trunk before she had gotten 3 steps, and he said, "Let me get that for you." She stopped and looked at him. Up close he could see the gray-green of her eyes and the particular sharpness in them, and she gave him the kind of measured look that a person gives something they are not entirely sure is worth trusting. "I am perfectly capable," she said. "I know it," he said, and he meant it, because he could tell just by looking at her that she was. "But the mud is deeper over by the walk, and this trunk will slow you down. I am going right past Henshaw's anyway." That last part was not true. Henshaw's boarding house was in the opposite direction from where he needed to go. He was not sure why he said it, except that he very much wanted to carry the trunk. Lydia Gentry looked at him for another 2 seconds, which felt considerably longer, and then she said, "Fine, but I will carry the bag." "I did not suggest otherwise," he said. She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and then decided against it, and they walked together through the mud toward Henshaw's boarding house, and Isaac carried the trunk and she carried the bag, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. Then she said, "You have mud on your jacket." He looked down. He did. It had been there before she arrived, from loading a fence post into a customer's wagon that morning. "I do," he agreed. "I only mention it because you looked like you were about to tell me something about the state of my boots." He had not been about to say anything of the kind. He had in fact been trying to think of something useful and interesting to say, which was not something he typically had to try for. "I was not going to say a word about your boots," he told her. "People always do," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, not quite tiredness but the cousin of it, something that suggested she had been arriving in new places with mud on her boots for long enough that the commentary had grown old. "They are fine boots," he said. "Practical." She glanced over at him, and this time the beginning of a smile actually made it to her lips before she thought better of it. "They are the best boots I own," she said, "and I have had them for 4 years, and I am not in the habit of apologizing for them." "Good," he said. "This town has enough people apologizing for things that don't need apologizing for." They reached Henshaw's boarding house, and Isaac set the trunk on the porch, and Clara Henshaw came out to meet them, wiping her hands on her apron and looking between Isaac and the newcomer with the particular brightness of a woman who found new arrivals entertaining. "You must be Miss Gentry," Clara said. "We have been expecting you." The school board rode ahead. "Yes," Lydia said, and then, because she apparently thought something else was required, she added, "I am sorry for the state of my boots. The road was wet." Isaac caught her eye over Clara's shoulder. He raised his eyebrows just slightly. She looked away, and this time the smile actually reached full completion on her face, brief and contained and entirely genuine, and Isaac Easton thought, with a certainty he could not explain and did not try to, that he was in a considerable amount of trouble. He retrieved his hardware crate. He walked back to his store. He set the crate down on the counter and stood there for a moment in the afternoon light with the sound of Caldwell going on around him, cattle bawling somewhere distant, and the piano from the Silver Spur already starting up even though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. And he thought about the way she had not apologized for her boots until she was standing in front of someone she felt she owed the courtesy to, and then said it like she was annoyed at herself for saying it. And he could not stop thinking about it. His business partner, a rangy man named Tom Greer who was 40 years old and had been married for 15 of them and considered himself something of an authority on the subject, came in through the back and found Isaac standing at the counter looking at the wall. "Coach came in?" Tom asked. "It did," Isaac said. "Hardware. On the counter." Tom looked at the crate and then at Isaac. "Something else come in on that coach." Isaac picked up a ledger and opened it to an entirely wrong page. "The new schoolteacher arrived," he said. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do not start," Isaac said. "I have not said a word. You were about to." "I was about to ask what she was like," Tom said, in a tone that was entirely too mild to be innocent. "For purely civic reasons. The town has been in need of a schoolteacher since Mrs. Alderman left in February." "She is sharp," Isaac said after a moment. "Sharp-tongued and sharp-eyed and not interested in being managed by anyone." Tom nodded slowly. And nothing," Isaac said. Tom picked up the crate and carried it to the back room. Over his shoulder he said, "You are going to do something embarrassing, and I want it on record that I could see it coming from the beginning." Isaac did not dignify that with a response, but he also did not disagree with it. Lydia Gentry's first full day in Caldwell began at 5 in the morning, which was when she was accustomed to rising, and it continued at 6 when she went to inspect the schoolhouse, which was a single-room building at the north edge of town that smelled of dust and mice and disuse, with 12 scarred wooden desks, a blackboard that needed rehanging because it had been put up crooked, and a stove in the corner that was not going to heat the room adequately when the real cold came in October. She stood in the center of it and made a mental list of everything that needed doing, and then she went to find whoever was responsible for the school board and told them, item by item, what she needed. The school board in Caldwell consisted of 3 men. Harvey Bowl, who ran the feed store and nodded at everything without committing to any of it. Arthur Pruitt, who was the mayor and considered himself a man of progress but mostly meant by that he wanted progress that did not cost him anything. And a third man, a rancher named Dale Connolly, who had 3 children who needed educating and was therefore the most motivated of the 3 and the one Lydia judged to be the most useful. She laid out her requirements clearly: more wood for the stove, chalk and adequate primer books because the ones currently in the schoolhouse were falling apart, a proper door latch because the current one did not catch, and the blackboard needed to be taken down and rehung level, or else she would spend half her day looking at a horizon that was not where a horizon was supposed to be. Arthur Pruitt told her that the budget was limited and they would see what they could do. Lydia told him what she could do with "we will see." Harvey Bowl stopped nodding and started blinking. Dale Connolly, who had the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors dealing with things that did not do what he wanted, looked at Lydia for a long moment and then said, "I can bring wood. My boys can do it before school starts." "Thank you," Lydia said, and she meant it, and Dale Connolly nodded in the way of a man who recognized a capable person and respected them for it. The blackboard was the problem. Taking it down and rehanging it required someone with the right tools and enough height to manage the upper brackets without a stepladder that was too short, which was what the school currently had. Lydia was considering whether she could manage it herself with enough patience and determination, which was her answer to most things, when Isaac Easton appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse at just past 9 in the morning. He was holding a toolbox. She looked at him. He looked at the crooked blackboard. "Dale Connolly came by the store," he said you needed the blackboard hung level. "I do," she said. "I have the tools for it." "I can see that." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the wind moved through the new-leaved cottonwood trees and sent a shimmer of light through the dusty schoolhouse windows. "Are you going to let me in, or would you like me to stand in the doorway all morning?" he asked. "I did not tell you to stand in the doorway," she said, and stepped back to let him through. He took the blackboard down carefully, which required standing on a crate and working the brackets loose without letting the heavy board drop, and Lydia held the bottom steady without being asked, and they did not talk much while he worked, but it was a comfortable kind of silence, the kind that settles between people who are focused on the same task and have implicitly agreed that the task is more important than conversation. He rehung the brackets level, using a spirit level he pulled from his toolbox, and then they lifted the board back together, and when it was up and straight and perfectly centered on the wall, Lydia stepped back and looked at it and said, "That is better." "It was pretty far off," he agreed, stepping down from the crate and picking up his toolbox. "About 11 degrees, she said. "I measured it with a protractor this morning." He stopped and looked at her. "You have a protractor?" "I am a school teacher," she said. "Of course I have a protractor." He smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face considerably, opened it up and made him look younger and easier, and she found herself filing it away in some internal catalog she had not meant to begin keeping. "Isaac Easton," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at the hand and then shook it. His grip was firm and his hand was rough with calluses, the hand of someone who worked with it regularly. "Lydia Gentry," she said. "I know," he said. "Word travels in Caldwell." "I imagine it does," she said, with a dryness that suggested she had already encountered some of this word traveling and had opinions about it. "What have you heard so far?" he asked, with what she recognized as genuine curiosity rather than the sly version of the question. That I am very tall for a woman, that my accent marks me as an outsider, and that my boots were muddy when I arrived. She tilted her head. I find that last one particularly memorable as a topic of conversation for grown people. I told you, Isaac said. I had nothing to say about the boots. You are the exception, she said. I have counted 3 separate comments this morning. A new record for a new town. She said this without evident hurt, which somehow made it more affecting rather than less, the tone of someone who has simply accepted being commented upon as a feature of their existence rather than anything particularly worth grieving. Isaac set his toolbox down on one of the desks and looked at her. You have moved to a lot of new towns, he asked. She began straightening the desks into better order, lifting and repositioning each one with focused efficiency. 3 before this one, she said. Lawrence, then Abilene, then briefly Dodge City, though that was a mistake I corrected inside of 4 months. Dodge City was too rough, he asked, picking up the other end of a desk to help her align it. She looked at him across the desk. Dodge City was not too rough, she said, and the edge in her voice was not unkind, just precise. I grew up in a mill town in western Massachusetts and then spent 4 years in Lawrence during a period when it was considerably less comfortable than it is now. I am not afraid of rough. Dodge City had a school board that did not actually want to educate anyone, which is a different problem entirely, and one I am not interested in accommodating. He set his end of the desk down and they moved to the next one. What about Lawrence and Abilene, he asked. She was quiet for a beat. Lawrence was good, she said. I stayed 4 years. The school outgrew what they needed from me. She did not elaborate on that. Abilene was fine for 2 years and then it became less fine. He did not push on what had made Abilene become less fine. Something told him that asking would be overstepping, and he found that he was content to be patient, which was not a feeling he associated with himself particularly strongly in relation to other people's histories. They finished straightening the desks. He picked up his toolbox. She looked at the room and made some small adjustment to the position of the chalk tray on the ledge of the blackboard. Thank you for the blackboard, she said, and this time she said it without the qualifier of capability she had offered the day before. No, I could have managed it myself, or anything of that kind. Just the thanks, simple and direct. Any time, he said. My store is on the main street, 3rd building from the end that has a porch. If you need anything else for the school, come by and I will see what I can do at cost. She raised an eyebrow. At cost? The school does not need to pay a profit margin, he said. The town benefits if the school functions. That is just arithmetic. She looked at him in that measuring way she had, and then she nodded once decisively. That is very sensible, she said. I have my moments, he said, and picked up his toolbox and left. And Lydia Gentry stood in the center of her new classroom and looked at the perfectly level blackboard and thought, with a precision she usually reserved for academic matters, that Isaac Easton was a more interesting man than he appeared to be at first, and he had appeared quite interesting at first. The school opened on a Monday, 3 weeks after Lydia's arrival, and 17 children between the ages of 6 and 14 filed in with the particular energy of young people who are not sure yet whether they are expected to be afraid or excited. Lydia settled the question immediately by being neither frightening nor frivolous, by being clear and organized and funny in a dry, unexpected way that children always responded to better than performed enthusiasm. Within the first week, attendance had not only held but improved, because word among children travels even faster than word among adults, and the word was that the new teacher was interesting, and that she did not talk down to you, and that she made arithmetic feel like solving a puzzle rather than being punished. Isaac learned this from 3 separate sources, 2 of them children he had given penny candy to at the store, and one of them Dale Connolly, who came in to buy rope and told Isaac, unprompted, that his youngest had come home and voluntarily done additional reading, which had never happened before in recorded history. Isaac found himself making excuses to walk past the school during the noon recess hour, which he recognized as transparent behavior, and did anyway. Sometimes he would see Lydia standing at the edge of the schoolyard watching the children play, her arms crossed and a slight smile on her face, the private kind of smile that people have when they think nobody is observing them, and they let themselves feel something without guarding it. Sometimes she would be in conversation with one of the older children, bent slightly to hear something, nodding with the serious attention of someone who believed the thing being said was worth taking seriously. Once she looked up and saw him on the other side of the fence, and they looked at each other across the yard for a moment, and then she raised her hand in a small wave that was more of a nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, and he touched the brim of his hat and kept walking, and his heart was going faster than it had any legitimate reason to be. He had been meaning to invite her to supper at the hotel dining room, which was the most presentable eating establishment in Caldwell, not least because it was the only one that had cloth on its tables, and which constituted something approaching a formal social gesture in a town that did not have much in the way of formality. He had been meaning to do this for 2 weeks, and he had been finding reasons not to, which was not behavior he typically engaged in. Isaac Easton was, by general agreement and his own assessment, a man who decided things and then did them. He had decided to build a supply store, and he had built it. He had decided to stay in Caldwell when other men had moved on, and he had stayed. He was not accustomed to hesitating. But there was something about Lydia Gentry that made him want to be careful, not careful the way you were careful with something fragile, because she was manifestly not fragile, but careful the way you were careful with something valuable, something you did not want to rush and spoil through impatience. Tom Greer watched him restocking shelves one afternoon and said, "You are going to lose your nerve entirely if you wait much longer." Isaac did not look up from the shelves. "You do not know what you are talking about. She had supper at the Connolly Ranch last Sunday," Tom said. "Dale's wife, Ruth, invited her. Ruth said she is charming and also completely impervious to being charmed by men who are not interesting, of which Caldwell has several." "That is a very precise report," Isaac said. "Ruth is a very precise woman," Tom said. "She also said that Miss Gentry mentioned your name." Isaac stopped restocking shelves. He turned around. "What did she say?" Tom's expression was infuriating in its pleasantness. "She said that you had fixed the schoolhouse blackboard and offered to supply materials at cost and that she found that admirable." Isaac turned back to the shelves. "That is not about me," he said. "That is about the blackboard." "Isaac," Tom said, "it is entirely about you." The following Saturday, which was the 6th Saturday after Lydia's arrival in Caldwell, Isaac walked to the boarding house at 6 in the evening, knocked on the front door, and when Clara Henshaw answered, asked whether Miss Gentry might be available for supper at the hotel dining room, if she was so inclined and had no other engagement. Clara Henshaw's face did something complicated and delighted before she went to relay the message, and she came back 3 minutes later to report that Miss Gentry would be ready at 6:30, which left him 25 minutes to go back to his rooms above the store and make himself look more presentable, which he did with more concentrated effort than he was fully comfortable acknowledging. Lydia came down the boarding house steps at 6:30 exactly, in a dress that was a deep blue-green, the color of deep water, and her hair was down differently than he had ever seen it, not in the severe pins of her workday style but softer, more loosely arranged, and she looked at him in his clean shirt and his brushed jacket, and something moved through her face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "Mr. Easton," she said. "Miss Gentry," he said. "You look well." "You are remarkably prompt," she said, which he understood was her version of returning the compliment. The hotel dining room was not elaborate, but it had 4 tables with white cloth and a cook who made a respectable roast chicken and a passable pie. They sat across from each other and ordered, and the conversation began carefully, the way conversations between careful people begin, with general things, with the town and the school and the spring weather. And then, because Lydia Gentry was not a woman who stayed on the surface of things for long, she said, "How did you end up in Caldwell? You do not strike me as native to Kansas." "Missouri," he said, "grew up on a farm outside Joplin, came west at 22 to see what was out here, and found Caldwell," she said. "Found several places before Caldwell," he said. "Spent a year in Texas working cattle drives, which cured me permanently of any romantic notions about cattle drives. Then moved north and ended up here and saw that there was no good supply store and decided to build one." "Just like that," she said. "More or less," he said. "I had saved some money by then." Tom Greer put in a third, and another fellow named Henry Marsh put in a third, and Henry moved on to Colorado after 2 years, but he let me buy out his share. She rested her chin on her hand, which was not a formal posture, and she clearly knew it and did not particularly care. "You are not a man who needs a great deal of infrastructure before he acts," she said, and it was meant as an observation, but it sounded very like a compliment, and he thought she probably knew that too. "I am not," he agreed, "though I have learned to take somewhat more time than I used to." "And is that an improvement?" He looked at her. The candlelight from the small lamp on their table made the gray-green of her eyes look warmer, tipped toward green. "Sometimes," he said. "And sometimes you can wait too long and the thing that needed doing no longer needs doing." She looked back at him steadily. There was a moment, and then she picked up her water glass and said, "Tell me about Lawrence. You mentioned you had not been there. I think you would have liked it." And that was how the conversation became easier, and the supper went for 2.5 hours, and when Isaac walked her back to Henshaw's boarding house in the soft dark of the spring evening with the stars out over the Kansas plain thick as scattered salt, they stood on the porch step for a moment, and Lydia said, "That was a pleasant evening, Mr. Easton." "Isaac," he said. She looked at him. "Isaac," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else, more real somehow, more its actual self. "Lydia," he said, and she made the sound that was the cousin of a laugh, brief and genuine. "Good night," she said, and went inside, and Isaac walked back through Caldwell under the stars feeling like a man who had just been handed something extraordinary and was trying to work out how to hold it without dropping it. The weeks that followed had the quality of a season changing, slow and inevitable, and shot through with small moments that accumulated into something that neither of them was naming yet, but that both of them could feel. He brought her books he had in the store, a second-hand natural history, and a volume of American poetry that a traveler had traded for supplies, and then apparently regretted leaving behind, because it was a very good volume. She read the natural history, and returned it with 3 pages of notes about the section on prairie fauna that were so detailed and interesting that he read the section over again specifically in order to understand them. And then they had a conversation about prairie dogs that lasted 45 minutes and ended with both of them knowing more about prairie dogs than they had going in. She began stopping at the store on her way back from the schoolhouse in the late afternoons, ostensibly for small supplies, paper or a new slate pencil, or the particular kind of thread that Mrs. Henshaw had asked her to pick up, and she would stand at the counter and they would talk, and Tom Greer would find reasons to be in the back room, which Isaac appreciated, and the conversations ranged over everything and nothing, books and weather and local politics, and whether Kansas would ever fully settle into itself, or whether it would always have this quality of a place in the middle of becoming something else. Lydia had opinions about everything, clear and unflinching, and usually arrived at through some process of actual reasoning rather than inheritance, which was not the way most people's opinions worked, and Isaac found himself challenged by her in a way that was deeply enjoyable rather than defensive, because she never delivered her opinions as verdicts on him, but as propositions to be examined, and she listened with genuine attention when he pushed back. And sometimes she changed her mind and said so clearly and without embarrassment, which was as rare as anything. He told her about his father, a stern man who had worked himself into an early grave on a farm that never quite produced what it needed to, and about his mother, who had been a reader and a singer and had died of fever when Isaac was 14. And those were things he did not often tell people, and he was not sure why he told her except that the words had come out in the natural course of a conversation, and he had not felt the need to stop them. She told him about her own parents, her father a mill superintendent who had strong ideas about education and had made sure she received one, her mother a woman who had wanted her to find a suitable husband and settle in the manner of suitable wives, and who had been disappointed on this score, respectfully but firmly, since Lydia was 19. She had gotten her teaching certificate at 21 and left for Lawrence and had not looked back, or had looked back only in the way of acknowledging where she came from, not in the way of wishing she were still there. "Did you ever want that?" Isaac asked, one evening when they were walking back from a town social where Lydia had been persuaded by Clara Henshaw to attend, and had spent the evening being largely sensible and occasionally dancing with great technical competence and minimal enthusiasm. "The settled life your mother envisioned." Lydia was quiet for the length of half a block. The stars were out again, and a night bird was singing somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. "I wanted something settled," she said, finally. "I wanted a place that was mine, a purpose that mattered. I found the purpose. The place has been more elusive." She paused. "I like Caldwell more than I expected to." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, her face in profile against the dark, the line of her jaw and her nose and the way she carried her head, straight and certain. "Good," he said, and the word carried more weight than a single word of 4 letters ought to reasonably carry, and she heard the weight in it, he could tell, because she glanced at him sideways and then back at the street ahead. "Do not read too much into it," she said, but her voice was mild when she said it, without the cutting edge she deployed in other circumstances. "I am not reading anything," he said. "I am simply glad." She did not answer that. But she did not move further away either, and they walked side by side the rest of the way to Henshaw's, closer together than strictly necessary given the width of the road. And when they reached the boarding-house steps, she turned to him and said, "Good night, Isaac," and he said, "Good night, Lydia." And it was becoming the rhythm of evenings, that exchange, both simple and not simple at all. What changed things? The way things that have been changing slowly suddenly reach the point where the change is undeniable, happened in July, when the Caldwell summer was at its most relentless, and the cattle drives coming up the Chisholm Trail brought new faces and noise into the town with every week. A man named Gerald Hatch had come into Caldwell 3 weeks prior as part of a drove operation, and he had decided, for reasons that were his own, that he was interested in Lydia Gentry. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he was a persistent one, and he did not take the responses of women very seriously as answers, which was a quality he shared with a number of men of his time and place, and which did not excuse it. He had asked her to dinner twice and been declined twice, politely the first time and with less polish the second, and this should have concluded the matter. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July, Lydia was coming out of the dry goods store with a package of items for the school supplies she had been collecting, and Hatch was standing on the walk outside, and the conversation that followed was not violent or dangerous in the physical sense of those words, but it was unpleasant and loud enough that 3 people on the street heard it, and Hatch put his hand on her arm when she tried to walk past him, and Lydia said, clearly and with a voice made of iron, "Remove your hand," and he did not immediately remove it. Isaac came around the corner from the post office in time to see the hand on her arm and Lydia's face, and what was on her face was not fear, exactly, but it was the controlled containment of a woman who was about to do something that she was calculating the consequences of, and the calculation was happening very fast. He crossed the distance in perhaps 6 strides, and he said, "Gerald," with a quietness that was not mild at all, and Hatch looked at him, and Isaac said, "Let the lady go about her business," and the tone of it was the kind of tone that men in the West generally recognized and respected, Not a threat precisely, but a clear communication of where the line was and what it meant to cross it. Hatch let go of her arm. He looked at Isaac and then at Lydia and then back at Isaac, and he said something under his breath that was not worth repeating, and he walked away down the street. Lydia looked at Isaac. He looked at her. She was holding the package with both hands and her chin was up, and he could see the fine edge of controlled anger in her, the tight set of her shoulders. "I had it in hand," she said. "I know," he said. "I did not need rescuing." "I know that too," he said, and he meant it, and something in the way he said it made her shoulders drop a fraction, the controlled edge softening just slightly. "But you also should not have to handle it alone. Not in this town. Not while I am 20 feet away and have working legs." She looked at him for a long moment. The July heat pressed down on the street around them, and somewhere a horse stamped and blew. "Thank you," she said. "Even so." "Even so," he agreed. She adjusted the package in her arms. "Walk me back to the school," she asked, and it cost her something to ask it, he could tell, because Lydia Gentry was not a woman who asked for things easily, and he understood that asking was its own kind of gift. "Yes," he said, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked the 3 blocks to the schoolhouse in the afternoon heat, and when they got there she set the package on the step and turned to him and said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. She looked at the door of the school and then at him. "The reason Abilene became less fine," she said, "was a man." "Not like that," she added quickly, meaning not like Hatch, and he nodded to show he understood. "A man I thought I trusted, who was in a position of authority over the school, who decided that my opinions were inconvenient and began working to undermine my position. He spread the kind of talk that does particular damage to a woman's professional reputation without ever saying anything that could be directly challenged." She paused. "I left because staying would have required a kind of fight that would have consumed everything else. I was not afraid of the fight. I was afraid of what I would have to become to win it." Isaac was quiet for a moment. The school building stood solid and small in the heat, her school, the one she had filled with books and a level blackboard and 17 children who were learning more than they had before she arrived. "That was not a weakness," he said, "leaving when you did." "I know it wasn't," she said, with a force that suggested she had not always known it as clearly as she did now. "I know that now, but I want you to understand why I am not always," she started again. "Why I am careful." "Lydia," he said, and something in the way he said her name made her look up at him. Not the careful look she often gave things, but something more direct and more unguarded. "I am not interested in managing you or undermining you or making decisions about what you should be. I am interested in you. In the actual you, the one who measures blackboards with a protractor and argues about prairie dogs and walks through mud without apology." She stared at him. Then she said, "That is a very specific list." "I have been paying attention," he said. Something happened in her face, something that opened in it, something he had not seen before, and he understood that this was the version of her that was not performing composure or brandishing capability, but just existing, just being herself without the armor on, and he found it more beautiful than anything he had words for. She reached out and took his hand, which was not something he had expected, and held it for a moment, looking down at their joined hands, his rough and broad and hers long-fingered and ink-stained from the schoolwork. "I think," she said carefully, the way she said things she was still in the process of working out, "that I am quite significantly in danger of being in love with you, Isaac Easton, and I find that alarming and also somewhat inevitable." He turned his hand over in hers. "Alarming," he repeated. "I have excellent reasons to find it alarming," she said. "I have never been particularly successful at staying somewhere." "You have not had particularly good reasons to stay," he said. She looked up at him. The gray-green of her eyes in the afternoon light was something he wanted to look at for a very long time. "No," she said quietly, "I have not." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was old-fashioned and perhaps more formal than the moment strictly required, but he meant it as a statement, as something deliberate and considered. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I built this store with my hands. I have 6 years of my life in this town, and I would like very much for you to have reasons to stay." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "You should know that I will still argue with you." "I would be very disappointed if you did not," he said. The sound she made was fully a laugh this time, clear and genuine and warm, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in Caldwell or anywhere else. He walked home through the July heat feeling like the Kansas plains had somehow expanded, like the horizon was further and better than it had been that morning, which was a fanciful notion for a man who generally kept his thinking practical, and he did not try to talk himself out of it. The summer deepened and then began its slow withdrawal, and Lydia and Isaac moved through the days of it together in the particular way of two people who have admitted something out loud and are now living in the space that the admission opened. They took Sunday rides together when the day permitted, borrowing horses from the Connolly ranch, Dale Connolly being thoroughly in favor of the whole enterprise, because his wife Ruth had declared it the most encouraging thing to happen in Caldwell all year. They rode out along the creek bed, where the cottonwoods lined the water in long green rows, and the prairie opened beyond them, vast and breathing, and indifferent to human concerns in a way that Lydia said she found comforting rather than diminishing. "It is easier to have the correct perspective on yourself when the sky is that large," she said, on one of these rides, looking out at the grassland rolling away to the south. "In Massachusetts, the sky is smaller. There is more in the way of it. Is that why you came west?" he asked. For the perspective, she considered this. They were stopped on a low rise, the horses standing easy, the late August light coming in at an angle that made everything look considered and intentional. "Partly," she said. "Partly it was simply that the East felt finished for me, as if I had understood it fully and there was nothing left to learn." "And you need to be learning," he said. "Not a question. Do not you?" she said, and she was not challenging him, just genuinely asking, and he thought about it seriously before answering. "I think I stopped learning for a while," he said. "Not from the world. I still learn things about farming and supply and weather and all the practical matters, but from people." He looked at the horizon. "I stopped expecting to be surprised by people. I think I had given up on it without knowing I had." She looked at him sideways. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her. "And now I am surprised," he said, "on a fairly regular basis." She smiled, and it was the private smile, the one she had when she thought no one was watching. Except now she was not trying to conceal it, and it was directed at him. And he thought that getting to see that smile regularly was something he would like to make permanent arrangements for. He had been thinking about asking her to marry him since sometime in late June, when they had been arguing about the question of whether the territorial legislature would make any movement on public education funding in the next session. And she had said something so precisely correct about the mechanics of legislative inertia that he had looked at her mid-argument and thought, with sudden total clarity, that he wanted to be arguing with this woman for the rest of his life, and that the word for that desire was marry. He waited until September, when the summer was truly winding down, and the schoolhouse had started its second session, and Lydia had been in Caldwell for 5 months, and showed every sign of having taken root in it, the way a good tree takes root, firmly and with intention. He had in that time procured a ring from a jeweler in Wichita, ordered through the mail, a simple thing with a small blue stone that had cost him more than he usually spent on anything that was not structural. And he had carried it in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks because he kept starting to ask her, and then deciding the moment was not right. And Tom Greer had noted the increased frequency with which Isaac checked his jacket pocket and had said, in tones of affectionate exasperation, "Isaac, for the love of all that is reasonable, just ask her." He asked her on a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of September, when they were sitting on the creek bank under the cottonwoods after one of their rides, the horses grazing at a distance, the afternoon light going golden, and the first hints of autumn in the air. She had her boots off because her feet were in the edge of the cold creek water, a liberty she took with country settings that she would not have taken in any other context, and she was reading aloud to him from the poetry volume he had given her, not performing the reading but sharing it, just offering the words out to the afternoon and the creek and him. She finished the poem, a long one about the American landscape, and let the silence that came after it settle, and he said, "Lydia." She turned to look at him, and he could see on her face that she knew, the way that perceptive people know when something is coming, not from any signal he had given but simply from the change in the quality of the moment. He took the ring from his pocket. He did not get off his knees because he was sitting cross-legged on the bank, and it would have been awkward, and he thought she would prefer directness to ceremony. He held it out to her in his palm. "I know you came to Caldwell for a teaching position and not for anything else," he said. "I know you have built a life here that is entirely your own, and that you do not need anyone to complete it. I am not asking because I think you need me. I am asking because I want to be in your life, specifically and deliberately, for all of it. The arguments about prairie dogs and the blackboards and the Sunday rides and every ordinary morning and every interesting difficulty. And I would like you to have my name if you want it. And if you do not want to change your name, I want you anyway. And if you want to keep teaching, I want you to keep teaching because you are excellent at it. And the children are lucky to have you, and I would not ask you to give up something you are excellent at for any reason." She had been looking at the ring in his palm while he spoke, and when he finished she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was related to them. "Isaac Easton," she said. "Yes," he said. "You have," she said carefully, as though choosing each word with the consideration it deserved, "just delivered the most thorough and also the most practical marriage proposal I have ever encountered, and I include in that category a number of proposals I received that were neither practical nor thorough, but which were delivered with a great deal more apparent drama." "I know what you are like," he said. "I did not think you wanted drama." "I do not want drama," she confirmed. "I want exactly what you just described." She took a breath. "Yes, Isaac, yes." He took her hand and put the ring on her finger, and her hand was steady where another woman's might have trembled, because Lydia Gentry was steady always, but he could feel in the grip of her fingers around his the particular pressure of a feeling too large to hold lightly. He leaned forward and kissed her, which was only the second time he had kissed her, the first being 2 weeks prior in circumstances that had also been somewhat unplanned, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. And the cottonwood leaves moved overhead in the September wind, and the creek ran cold and clear over the stones, and the horses grazed in the late gold of the afternoon. They were married in November, at the small Methodist church on Caldwell's 3rd Street, in a ceremony that was modest by choice and well attended by the fact that the whole town was interested. Ruth Connolly organized a wedding supper at the Connolly Ranch House, which was large enough to hold it, and she did this with the quiet efficiency of a woman who considers the proper celebration of good things to be a civic responsibility. Tom Greer was Isaac's witness and Clara Henshaw was Lydia's, and Dale Connolly's 3 children sat in the front pew of the church and were unusually well behaved, because Lydia Gentry was their teacher, and they would not have embarrassed her on her wedding day for anything in the world. Lydia wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, not white because white was impractical for the Kansas climate, and she was, as has been established, a practical woman, but a deep cream color that suited the red in her hair and the green in her eyes, and she walked up the aisle of that small church on her own because her father was in Massachusetts and could not make the journey, and she had not asked anyone to escort her because she did not need escorting. She was walking toward a thing she had chosen clearly and completely, and she walked like it. Isaac, standing at the front of the church, watched her come down the aisle, and he had the sensation of seeing for the first time the full scale of something he had been looking at closely for months, seeing it from a distance and understanding it differently, and he thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever known, and he thought this with the calm of someone who has finished the process of deciding and arrived at certainty. They said their vows with the practical solemnity of people who mean them and do not require embellishment. And when the Reverend said Isaac could kiss his bride, Isaac kissed her with appropriate tenderness, and Lydia's hand came up to his jaw and held him there for just a moment. And Clara Henshaw made a small sound of genuine emotion and then recovered herself. The supper at the Connolly Ranch was long and warm and full of the particular joy of a community celebrating two of its own, and Isaac danced with Lydia twice, slowly and close, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and he felt her breathe, and it was the most perfect and ordinary thing he had ever experienced. They moved into the house Isaac had begun building in October, a proper house with 3 rooms and a board floor and a real stove, larger than his rooms above the store, with a room that Lydia immediately designated as a study and filled with her books. She kept teaching. She had been clear that she would, and Isaac had been clear that he wanted her to, and the school board, somewhat to their own surprise, found that the marriage of their schoolteacher made her more settled and no less capable, which had not been their unanimous expectation. The winter came in hard across Kansas, the wind off the plains finding every gap in every building with scientific thoroughness, and Lydia and Isaac spent the cold months in the warmth of their house and the warmth of each other's company. She helped him with the store accounts in the evenings, because she was better at the kind of organized, systematic bookkeeping that the accounts required, and she said so plainly, and he agreed plainly, and they worked side by side at the table in the study while the wind pressed against the walls outside. He learned that she slept lightly and woke entirely at once, no gradual surfacing, just awake and present, which was at first somewhat startling and became familiar and then beloved. She learned that he could not hear something read aloud without wanting to discuss it immediately, which she found deeply compatible with her own nature. He learned that she was at her sharpest in the late morning and at her most thoughtful in the early evening, and he calibrated his conversations accordingly. She learned that he communicated affection through actions more than words, but that when he said something, he meant it completely, and she came to trust the silence between his words as much as the words themselves. She learned what he did not say easily, and she did not press him for it, but sometimes in the evenings when they were sitting quietly together, she would simply reach across the space between them and put her hand on his, and he would look at her, and she would look back, and some exchange would happen that did not require any language at all. In the spring of 1879, when Lydia had been in Caldwell for a full year and the school had just concluded its second full session, Ruth Connolly observed over tea that Lydia was looking somewhat different than usual, and Lydia, who was precise about her own body as about everything else, said that she suspected she was expecting a child, and Ruth set down her teacup and said, "Well," with tremendous warmth, and then asked whether she had told Isaac yet. She had not told Isaac yet. She told him that evening after supper, sitting at the table with the oil lamp between them and the study behind her full of books and the smell of the supper still in the air. And she told him in the way she did things, directly and without ceremony, and she watched his face. He was still for a moment, and then something happened in his face that she had never seen before, something completely unguarded, something that was all the way open, and he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his and said her name, just her name, Lydia, and could not seem to say anything else for a moment, and she thought this was perhaps the most eloquent she had ever seen him. "Are you frightened?" he asked finally. "Yes," she said, because she was, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, "and also very glad." "Me too," he said, both things, and he turned her hands over in his and held them. The summer of 1879 passed in the particular texture of expectation, large and warm and full of small preparatory tasks. The crib Isaac built in the evenings in the back room of the store and brought home piece by piece. The small garments Clara Henshaw and Ruth Connolly appeared with regularly. having apparently organized some kind of cooperative sewing effort without informing anyone. The books Lydia read on the subject of infant care with the same systematic thoroughness with which she read anything she needed to know. She kept teaching until the end of June, when the summer session ended and the school recessed until September. And by the time September came, she had arranged for a young woman from the Methodist congregation, a capable 17-year-old named Jane Aldis who had shown clear academic aptitude, to assist in the classroom for the fall session, so that there would be support when the baby came. Their son was born on the 23rd of October, 1879, in the house with the board floors and the study full of books, attended by the Caldwell doctor and Ruth Connolly, who had stated firmly that she was going to be present, and whose firmness in this regard Lydia had found more comforting than she would have admitted beforehand. He was healthy and large and screamed his arrival into the Kansas autumn with great conviction, which the doctor said was an excellent sign, and which Lydia, exhausted and entirely herself, said suggested he had inherited her disposition, which made Isaac laugh in a way that was not quite steady. They named him James after Isaac's father, because Isaac had complicated feelings about his father that were best resolved by honoring him, and Thomas after Tom Greer, who was so moved by this that he had to spend several minutes examining the contents of his hat. Tom Greer held James Easton in the careful way of a man who has held babies before and takes the responsibility seriously, and he looked at Isaac across the room and said, "He has your jaw," and then looked at Lydia and added, "And I think probably your opinions." And Lydia said from where she was resting in the bed, "God help everyone if that is the case," and everyone in the room laughed, and James, unimpressed by this, slept through all of it. James proved, in the months that followed, to have inherited elements of both his parents in roughly equal measure, his father's steadiness and his mother's acute observational attention, and he watched the world from his first weeks with the focused concentration of someone taking very careful notes, which Lydia found both amusing and recognizable. Lydia returned to teaching in January, having arranged her classroom schedule and the help of Jane Aldis, so that the school could function and James could be brought to her at the noon hour. This was not the standard practice for a woman of the era, and Lydia was aware of this, and she addressed the school board's concerns about it with the same systematic clarity she brought to everything. And Dale Connolly said he did not see any problem with it, and Harvey Bowl nodded without committing to anything, and Arthur Pruitt said the town needed the teacher enough that he was not going to argue the details, which was as much support as Arthur Pruitt generally managed. The town of Caldwell continued to grow around them, as Kansas towns grew in that era, sometimes smoothly and sometimes with the friction of a place that has not yet decided entirely what it wants to be. More families arrived, which meant more children in the schoolhouse, which meant that by 1880 Lydia was pressing the school board for a larger building, and she pressed them with the same focused determination she had brought to every previous demand, and the new building was under construction by the fall of 1880, larger and better lit, and with a proper stove that actually heated the room. And Lydia stood in the middle of it when the walls were up, and looked at it with the expression she had when something had been accomplished that needed accomplishing. Isaac came to find her there one evening when the construction crew had gone home, standing in the unfinished building with the late light coming through the gaps in the walls and the smell of fresh lumber around her, and James on her hip, because the baby was 2 months past a year, and mobile and opinionated and needed to be held or held onto at all times. He leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment, the way she looked at the walls going up around her future classroom, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he could not imagine his life without her in it, not as an absence but as something fundamental, like weather, like the horizon, like the particular quality of Kansas light that he had stopped noticing because he had lived with it long enough, and then some mornings when it hit the plains just so. still could not believe how beautiful it was. She turned and saw him in the doorway. James spotted him and produced the sound he made when he saw Isaac, a sound that was somewhere between a demand and a celebration, and held out his arms. Isaac crossed the half-finished floor and took his son, who immediately grabbed a fistful of his jacket lapel and chewed on it with the purposeful dedication of the very young, and Isaac looked at Lydia. "It is going to be a good room," he said. "It is," she agreed, looking at the walls. "It is going to be very good." He put his free arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, which she did easily now, the way of a woman who has given up the performance of not needing anything and arrived at the simpler country of accepting the things that were good. And they stood together in the unfinished schoolroom in the fading Kansas afternoon light, the three of them, and the wind came off the plain outside and found the gaps in the walls and moved through the building like something alive. "Do you know what I was thinking this morning?" She said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the boots," she said. He waited. "When I stepped off that coach," she said, "I was so tired and so determined and so certain that nothing about this town was going to matter to me in any permanent way, and I looked up and all I could think was that it was not what I had been promised, and then I looked down and thought, well, there goes the boots." She paused. "I have no idea what made you walk over." "I have an idea," he said. "Do you?" "You looked like someone who was going to do something interesting," he said. "I have always had difficulty not walking toward interesting things." She turned her head and looked up at him. James, bored with the lapel, was now exploring the situation with one small hand pressed against Isaac's jaw, and Isaac turned his face and pressed his lips to the small palm, and the baby laughed with the uncomplicated delight of babies in receipt of affection. And Lydia watched this, and the thing in her face was the open thing, the unguarded thing, the look that was only for here and only for them. "I am glad you have that difficulty," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." She reached up and straightened the brim of his hat, which James had knocked sideways, a small gesture, the kind of gesture that couples develop in the intimacy of daily life, a maintenance of each other, a steady touching base. He caught her hand as she lowered it and held it, his thumb moving across the ring on her finger, the blue stone of it. "I need to get James home," she said. "I know," he said. Neither of them moved immediately. Outside, the prairie evening was coming in wide and gold, and lit from underneath by a sun that was almost at the horizon, and the town of Caldwell was making its evening sounds, smoke starting from chimneys and horses being put away for the night, and the distant bawling of the Connolly cattle settling for dark. "Come on then," she said, and took James back into her arms, and Isaac put his arm around her shoulders again, and they walked out of the unfinished schoolhouse into the Kansas evening and went home. The years that followed had the quality of a thing built with intention, solid and well-made, and continuing to grow. The new schoolhouse opened and filled, and Lydia taught in it with the same unwavering excellence she had brought to the smaller building, and her reputation as a teacher spread through the county in the way that good teachers' reputations spread, through the children who carry what they learn in school out into the rest of their lives and do not forget where they got it. James grew from a baby into a boy, determined and observant and possessed of the particular combination of practicality and idealism that was his parents' specific inheritance to him. He had Isaac's dark hair and Lydia's gray-green eyes and a stubbornness that was equally attributable to both of them. And he was at home in the supply store and at home in the schoolhouse and at home on the prairie, which was a good kind of child to be in Caldwell, Kansas in the 1880s. 2 years after James, in the winter of 1881, Lydia and Isaac's second child was born, a girl they named Eleanor, after nobody in particular, just a name Lydia had always thought was both elegant and sturdy enough to carry the weight of an actual life, which was how she thought about names. Eleanor turned out to be unlike her brother in temperament, sunny and expressive and prone to musical humming at all hours, and where James watched the world take notes, Eleanor seemed simply to delight in it on general principle, and Isaac said she had her mother's determination but none of her reserve, and Lydia said that was an improvement on the original design, and Isaac said he could not agree with that, and they argued about it in the pleasant, circular way of arguments that are really just the expression of two people who enjoy each other's minds. The store grew, and Isaac took on a second assistant when Tom Greer's wife's health began to require Tom at home more often than the store could accommodate, and Isaac handled it with the practical care he brought to all such transitions, making sure Tom's financial stake in the store remained, and that the arrangement was fair. Tom recovered from whatever guilt he had about stepping back when it became clear that Isaac had managed things sensibly, and he came in 3 days a week for years afterward, more for the company than the necessity, which was what it was. The cattle drives thinned as the decade advanced and the railroads changed the nature of the cattle business, and Caldwell adapted the way frontier towns either adapt or don't, and the ones that don't survive. Caldwell survived. It grew quieter and more settled, which the families were glad of, and the old cowboys mourned in the way people always mourn the end of a thing that was both hard and alive. And Lydia wrote about it in the journal she kept, about the changing quality of the town's character, because she was a person who thought it mattered to record such things. She read to her children in the evenings, James and Alina side by side on the small settle in the front room, the oil lamp turning everything warm and amber, and Isaac would be at the table with a ledger or a letter, and he would stop what he was doing to listen. And sometimes he would look up from whatever he was reading and see his wife's face and his children's faces in the lamplight, the old house full of books and warmth, and the particular sound of her voice reading things that were worth reading. And he would feel something so complete and sufficient that he did not have words for it and did not need them. On their 10th wedding anniversary in November of 1888, Isaac gave Lydia a new pair of boots. They were brown leather, good quality, made by a craftsman in Wichita whose work he had sourced specifically, and they were lined for warmth and had a small engraving on the inside of the right one that said L.E. Nav. 1878, her initials, which had changed the day they married, and the date of their wedding, which felt right. She opened the box and looked at the boots and then looked at him, and the look on her face was the open one, the fully open one, and she said, "You remembered." "I told you," he said, "I had nothing to say about the boots." She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the warm one, and she took the boots out of the box and put them on, and they fit perfectly because he had been attentive enough over 10 years of living with someone to know exactly what size their boots were, and she stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around him, which she did now without calculation or reserve, and he put his arms around her and held on. 10 years, she said, against his collar. 10 years, he said. Isaac, she said. Lydia, he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. He looked back. He was 41 now, with gray coming into the dark hair, and she was 36, and the years were in both their faces in the way of years that have been lived fully and not just passed through, and she looked at him with the directness she had always had and the openness she had learned to let him see, and she said, "I am very glad I got off that stagecoach in Caldwell." He thought about that October afternoon 6 years before he had met her, when he had looked at a town that needed a supply store and thought he would stay, and how he could not have known then what staying would come to mean, what the particular geography of this town would accumulate into. He thought about a woman with mud on her boots and a sharp tongue and a protractor in her bag stepping off a stagecoach and looking at a new town with eyes that dared it to be worth her time, and the way something in his chest had shifted and not shifted back. "I am very glad you did too," he said. Outside, the November wind moved across the Kansas plain in the way it had for years before anyone arrived and would for years after, wide and certain and indifferent to individuals, but somehow, in the way of large and honest things, a comfort to anyone willing to be still enough to feel it. The house was warm. The children were asleep in their rooms. The supply store stood solid on the main street, and the schoolhouse stood solid on its corner, and both of them bore the work of these two people's lives in the way that buildings bear the intent of the people who build and tend them. In the front room, the oil lamp burned steady on the table, and the books stood in their rows in the study. Lydia's books and Isaac's books mixed together, now so thoroughly that neither of them could remember clearly which had come from whose collection. She was still wearing the boots. He looked down at them and smiled, small and private, the kind of smile he had learned from her, the one you have when something is good and you are not performing it for anyone, just feeling it. She caught him looking and knew exactly what he was looking at. "They are excellent boots," she said. "They are the best boots in Caldwell," he said. "They are," she agreed, and she took his hand and they sat together in the lamplight in their house in Caldwell, Kansas, with the wind outside and the children sleeping and the whole long, good, unfinished-looking life of things still ahead of them. And it was entirely enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.